We often view conflict as a disagreement of opinion, assuming that clearer explanations would resolve the gap. Psychology suggests otherwise. Many conflicts persist because people aren't experiencing the same reality. They are responding to different internal representations of what is happening. This makes disagreement structural rather than superficial. Disagreement over opinion feels manageable, but disagreement over obvious reality feels like a threat. This triggers emotional escalation and moralization. Understanding perception is thus a practical necessity for emotional regulation and safety. To navigate this, we must avoid naive relativism, which says all views are equally valid, and naive realism that claims one's own view is self-evidently correct. Both errors create harm. The aim here is neither to deny reality nor to surrender to subjectivity. The aim is practical intelligence, to understand why people differ so deeply, why agreement is not the norm, and how to remain calm, clear, and protected in a world of persistent difference. This requires 3 shifts. First, recognizing that perception is not passive reception, but active construction. Second, accepting that diversity of perception is not an anomaly, but a biological and cultural norm. Third, learning to distinguish between a difference that can be tolerated and a difference that signals genuine danger. Most people carry an implicit assumption about perception that it works like a camera. The world exists out there, the senses capture it, and the brain records what is present. Psychology and neuroscience show this assumption to be false. Human senses provide limited, incomplete, and ambiguous information. Vision captures only a narrow band of light. Hearing filters unnecessary sounds aggressively. Attention excludes most incoming data before awareness ever begins. Perception, therefore, starts with absence. The brain must fill gaps, resolve ambiguity, and produce a usable interpretation fast enough to guide action. Its goal is not truth in the abstract, but functional usefulness. Modern neuroscience increasingly describes this process as predictive processing, associated with the work of Karl Friston. The brain continuously generates expectations about what is likely happening and uses sensory input primarily to correct large errors. Only when incoming data strongly contradicts that guess does the internal model update. This explains a crucial fact. Perception prioritizes speed and usefulness, not accuracy in an abstract sense. From an evolutionary perspective, a fast, coherent interpretation that enables action is often more valuable than a perfectly accurate one that arrives too late. As a result, perception is shaped by prior experience, memory, emotional learning, and context. What you have encountered before strongly influences what you see now. What has mattered to you in the past determines what stands out in the present. This is why 2 people can witness the same situation and walk away with fundamentally different impressions, without either one lying or being irrational. Perception is not discovered. It is constructed. This does not mean reality is imaginary. It means reality is filtered, interpreted, and stabilized into a coherent experience. And once that experience feels stable and obvious, disagreement no longer feels like difference. It feels like error. That is where conflict truly begins. One of the most important features of human perception is something we rarely notice. Perception is shaped not only by prediction, but by attention. And attention is selective by necessity. What you see is what you look for. At any moment, the environment contains far more information than the brain can process. Attention acts as a filter, determining which elements are highlighted and which are ignored. What receives attention is influenced by goals, fears, expectations, and prior learning. If you are worried about threat, you notice danger cues. If you are focused on opportunity, you notice openings. If you are emotionally invested in a particular outcome, evidence related to that outcome becomes more salient. Perception is therefore not just about what is present, it is about what is prioritized. This is not speculation. It is one of the most robust findings in psychology, famously demonstrated by the selective attention test, often called the invisible gorilla experiment. Participants were asked to watch a video of people passing basketballs and count the number of passes made by one team. While they were counting, a person in a full gorilla suit walked into the center of the scene, paused, beat their chest, and walked out. Roughly half the participants never noticed the gorilla at all. Their eyes recorded the light reflecting off the gorilla, but because that information was irrelevant to their goal, their brains discarded it before it reached conscious awareness. This phenomenon, inattentional blindness, demonstrates a critical fact. Perception is shaped by relevance, not completeness. Two people can be in the same room, hear the same words, and see the same faces, yet walk away with different understandings of what mattered most. Each mind highlights different features and suppresses others. And importantly, this filtering is not a conscious choice. People do not decide what to notice. They notice what their perceptual systems have been tuned to notice. Given all this construction, why does perception feel so trustworthy? Because the brain does not label its outputs as hypotheses. The final perceptual model arrives in consciousness as a finished product. It does not come with a disclaimer saying, "This is a best guess based on limited data." It arrives as, "This is what is happening." From the inside, certainty feels natural. This is not a flaw, it is a design feature. A system that constantly doubts itself would be unable to act. Survival requires decisiveness. But in social life, this same mechanism creates friction. When two people hold different perceptual models, each experiences their own model as obvious and the other's as distorted. Disagreement does not feel like a difference of interpretation. It feels like a difference between seeing clearly and failing to see. This is the psychological root of many conflicts that appear irrational from the outside. Once perception delivers a coherent experience, the mind makes a quiet but consequential leap. It forgets that the experience is constructed and treats it as a direct reflection of reality itself. This assumption is known in psychology as naive realism, a concept extensively studied by social psychologist Lee Ross. Naive realism is the belief that we see the world objectively, our perceptions reflect reality as it truly is. Reasonable people exposed to the same situation should see the same thing. When others disagree, naive realism supplies an explanation. The problem must lie with them. This idea is often illustrated through a much older story. The Six Blind Men and the Elephant. In the poem written by John Godfrey Saxe in 1872, six blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. Each touches a different part of the animal. One touches the trunk and concludes the elephant is like a snake. Another touches the leg and insists it is a tree. Another presses against the side and declares it a wall. Each man speaks with confidence, none expresses doubt. The crucial detail is not that they disagree, but that they argue. Each ridicules the others. Each believes his conclusion is obvious, and the others are foolish. This is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about certainty. Each man touched something real. Each gathered genuine sensory information. Each formed a coherent interpretation from limited data. And none received an internal signal saying, "You are missing something important." This is the critical insight. Certainty does not require completeness. Perception does not announce its own limits. It does not say, "This is one piece of a larger whole." It says, "This is what is here." Once that experience settles, disagreement no longer feels like difference. It feels like error. And error, when persistent, feels threatening. This is how disagreement becomes personal. This is how debate becomes moralized. This is how conflict emerges even when no one is acting in bad faith. The blind men are not unusual. They are normal. The deepest lesson of the parable is not that people see different things. It is that certainty amplifies partial truth into total conviction. And it explains why expecting agreement as the default leads to chronic frustration. People attend to different cues, prioritize different values, and notice different details. From those inputs, they construct internally coherent interpretations. Each interpretation feels complete from the inside. When these interpretations collide, naive realism reframes disagreement as a defect. This is why people say things like, "I don't understand how anyone could think that." It's obvious what's going on. They're just ignoring reality. These statements do not reflect cruelty or stupidity. They reflect the natural consequences of how perception works. What the blind men fail to recognize is the difference between local reality and global reality. Each man's experience is locally accurate. It truthfully reflects the small portion of the elephant he encounters. The mistake occurs when local accuracy is mistaken for global completeness. None of the men is lying, none is irrational, each is describing something real. Human perception is designed for local reliability, not total understanding. The mind prioritizes interpretations that work from its immediate position. It does not automatically account for perspectives it has never accessed. Naive realism arises at this boundary. It is the moment when the mind stops treating experience as a partial window and begins treating it as the full landscape. This confusion between local and global reality is not an intellectual failure. It is a structural feature of human cognition. But when unrecognized, it becomes a reliable engine of conflict. Recognizing naive realism leads to a practical shift. Disagreement is no longer treated as an anomaly to be eliminated, but as a predictable outcome of human perception. Disagreement does not automatically signal ignorance or bad faith, but neither does it automatically guarantee safety or harmlessness. Together, naive realism and confirmation bias form a powerful escalation loop. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek, notice, remember, and trust information that supports what we already believe while discounting or ignoring what challenges it, causing beliefs to harden rather than correct over time. In other words, evidence doesn't neutralize belief, it often selectively reinforces it. Naive realism convinces each person that their perception reflects reality itself. Confirmation bias then reinforces that perception over time. The longer the disagreement persists, the more confident each side becomes. This loop explains why conflicts often intensify rather than resolve. It also explains why people are frequently surprised by how divided others seem. Each side is living inside a reality that feels increasingly obvious, coherent, and self-evident. From the inside, nothing appears irrational. From the outside, the divide looks incomprehensible. Recognizing confirmation bias leads to a practical adjustment. If perceptual differences are reinforced rather than corrected by time, then expecting agreement as a default outcome is unrealistic. Persisting in that expectation produces frustration, anger, and exhaustion. Lowering expectations of agreement is therefore not resignation, it is clarity. It allows disengagement from unproductive conflict without interpreting withdrawal as defeat. It preserves emotional and cognitive energy for decisions that actually matter. But this clarity immediately raises a more difficult question, one that explanation alone cannot answer. If people sincerely believe their own models, and those models harden over time, how do we distinguish harmless differences from genuine danger? Confirmation bias explains why realities harden. It does not explain when hardening becomes a threat. Human diversity is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Biology, psychology, and culture naturally produce variation in threat sensitivity, moral emphasis, attention, emotional reactivity, and tolerance for ambiguity. Research summarized by Richard Nisbett shows that even basic cognitive habits, what people notice, how they categorize, how they reason, vary systematically across cultures. These differences are not moral failures. They are adaptive strategies shaped by history, environment, and social structure. But this realism also requires acknowledging that not all differences are equally safe. Difference becomes dangerous not at the level of belief, but at the level of enforcement. A person may hold views you find strange, incorrect, or offensive and still pose no threat. Danger arises when disagreement is no longer tolerated, when difference is treated as something that must be corrected, punished, or eliminated. Protective wisdom evaluates patterns, not professions of intent. The three core distinctions of protective wisdom are perception versus intent. Perception explains how someone sees the world. Intent reveals what they plan to do about it. Differences in perception are normal. Danger appears when intent includes coercion, domination, punishment for dissent, or elimination of alternatives. Protective wisdom does not pathologize unusual beliefs. It examines what those beliefs authorize. To belief behavior. Beliefs exist internally, behavior manifests externally. History shows that harm is not caused by belief alone, but by how belief is imposed. Protective wisdom asks, are dissenters allowed to exist? Is disagreement punished? Are exits permitted? Is force used to compel conformity? Systems that tolerate disagreement remain within difference. Systems that suppress dissent through fear or force cross into danger. This distinction prevents both moral panic and moral blindness. Flexibility versus rigidity. Among all warning signs, rigidity is the most reliable predictor of danger. Healthy systems can revise beliefs, admit error, tolerate uncertainty, and respond to feedback. Dangerous systems cannot. They become self-sealing. Doubt is treated as betrayal. Correction is framed as an attack. This insight aligns with the warning articulated by Karl Popper. Unlimited tolerance toward intolerant systems ultimately destroys tolerance itself. Protective wisdom does not oppose difference. It opposes coercive rigidity. Why rigidity is seductive? If rigidity is dangerous, why does it attract followers? The answer is not stupidity, it is psychological relief. In The True Believer, Eric Hoffer observed that mass movements recruit not through the quality of their ideas, but by offering refuge from inner instability. Certainty reduces anxiety. Identity reduces confusion. Belonging reduces isolation. This does not make followers foolish, it makes them human. But psychological comfort does not equal moral safety. Why rigidity feels righteous. Moral psychology deepens this insight. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt shows that moral judgment begins with intuition, not reasoning. Reasoning typically follows, serving to justify conclusions already reached emotionally. Rigid systems, therefore, do not merely believe they are right. They feel right. Disagreement feels immoral. Opposition feels threatening. Correction feels like an attack. This is why dangerous systems rarely experience themselves as dangerous. Protective wisdom recognizes the dynamic without being seduced by it. Understanding why rigid systems attract followers explains how danger spreads. Protective wisdom recognizes this dynamic without being seduced by it. Empathy for psychological relief does not require blindness to behavioral risk. Up to this point, we have assumed a shared emotional architecture, one in which empathy, guilt, and remorse act as internal constraints on harmful behavior. Psychology shows that this assumption is not always valid. Clinical research, summarized by Robert D. Hare in Without Conscience, documents individuals whose emotional processing differs significantly from the norm. Such individuals may show shallow affect, reduced empathy, and diminished capacity for remorse. This is not a difference of opinion. It is a difference of internal constraint. In such cases, moral language may be used instrumentally rather than sincerely. Cooperation may be simulated rather than felt. Charm may coexist with exploitation. This does not imply that such traits are common, nor that disagreement signals pathology, only that shared emotional constraints cannot be assumed. Protective wisdom does not assume that everyone who disagrees is dangerous, but it does recognize that some differences are not merely perceptual, they are structural. And structural differences require structural caution. Here are some practical detection tools for rigidity tests. Protective wisdom relies on patterns, not impressions. Certain questions reliably reveal when the difference is drifting toward danger. Can an error be admitted without collapse? Is dissent tolerated without retaliation? Are exits allowed without punishment? Does disagreement lead to dialogue or to force? Are there internal, emotional, or institutional brakes on harm? The more consistently a system fails these tests, the higher the risk. No single signal is decisive. Patterns are. Protective wisdom is often misunderstood as fear-based thinking. In reality, it reduces fear by replacing ambiguity with criteria. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Preparedness thrives in clarity. Prepared individuals do not panic at differences. They observe behavior over time, they notice rigidity early, they set boundaries before escalation. Calm and vigilance are not opposites. They are complements. Protective wisdom makes a final adjustment. It lowers expectations of similarity, to reduce unnecessary anger, to conserve emotional energy, to accept diversity as normal. At the same time, it raises standards for behavior. No coercion, no enforced conformity, no punishment for dissent. This balance allows one to remain humane without becoming exposed. Understanding perception explains sincerity. Naive realism explains conflict. Confirmation bias explains persistence. Protective wisdom explains survival. Difference is inevitable. Agreement is not guaranteed. Safety is not automatic. The task is not to eliminate difference, but to navigate it intelligently, calmly, clearly, and with eyes open. The goal is not to win arguments. The goal is not to eliminate differences. The goal is to see accurately and to remain prepared. Remember this: people are different. Agreement is not guaranteed. Differences are normal. Danger is specific. Learn to tell them apart. That skill, calm, precise, and protective, is wisdom in practice. Your journey toward practical wisdom begins with clarity, and I'm honored to walk that path with you. Together, we're building a world where wisdom is practical, accessible, and deeply human. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it with others, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and as always, think deeply, live wisely,